By now, you are likely familiar with the new weapons deal between the United States and Europe, which ultimately sends arms to Ukraine. Given where things stood only a handful of months ago, it may be surprising that we now stand where we are today. Well, thanks to some reporting, we have a better idea how it came together, with that account endorsed by, or at least reposted by, one of its key players. And it says a great deal about the White House's internal dynamics, and how quickly Europe can act to take advantage of those fissures when it wants to. So let's examine how our favorite lines on maps became slightly more favorable to Ukraine. At its core, today's story is about three dichotomies. First is the now apparent rift inside of the White House, featuring a rare case of two very different national security outlooks. One camp resides in the Pentagon, headlined by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and his Undersecretary for Policy Bridge Colby. This is the deep pivot to the Indo-Pacific Plan, come hell, high water, or the slow burn destruction of Ukraine. The other camp resides at the State Department, led by Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg. They are also in favor of an Indo-Pacific pivot. It is the reality of the geopolitical environment, as we recently explored. But they would like to see a bit more moderation in its implementation. Protect Ukraine, attrit Russia, and put the Western coalition in a better position to eventually work together on the big issues across the globe. Just don't burn down Ukraine in the process. Well, coming into July, the Pentagon was winning the internal battle. The United States had recently wrapped up a campaign against the Houthis in Yemen. It was supposed to be a light engagement, but the Department of Defense grew nervous over just how quickly the United States was burning through its stockpiles. This resulted in Hegseth unilaterally freezing arms transfers to Ukraine on July 2nd, including weaponry sitting in Poland, just waiting to drive to the border with Ukraine. Now, it is perfectly normal for a Secretary of Defense to do things without seeking the approval of the President. The entire point of a cabinet system is that the President is a single person, and he cannot do everything everywhere all at once. However, this was a bit of a power play given the political implications of cutting aid, and Trump's own meeting with Zelensky at the NATO summit, which had suggested a path for greater arms sales to Ukraine. Personally, if I were the Secretary of Defense, it is the type of thing that I would run by not only the President, but also the Secretary of State, and then the main person responsible for Ukraine war diplomacy. As it stood, Trump was blindsided, while Rubio and Kellogg only learned about it via the news. The second dichotomy is Trump's feelings about NATO. What has driven the conversation there for about a decade is his frustration with allies free-riding on U.S. defense spending. Now, that makes it sound like it is a Trump versus NATO thing, but NATO is not one military with one budget. It is a collection of 32 countries with 32 separate budgets. Trump's anger is directed more toward the western half of Europe, which has perennially been below the original target of 2% of GDP spent on defense. Spain and Belgium as examples. You do not see Trump chiding NATO's eastern flank by comparison. A country like Poland, spending 4.12% of GDP in 2024, is not free-riding. It leads the entire alliance in proportional military spending, above even the United States. Keep that in mind for later. The third dichotomy is in how you may have heard about the sudden stop in military transfers. As it stands, Ukraine has secured funds for 3 Patriot systems so far. Left-leaning sources reporting that news focused on Ukraine's humanitarian needs in the war. In contrast, right-leaning sources were muted in their analysis, reflecting the rift in their camp. How do I know this? It is thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Ground News. Ground News helps me keep apprised of all of the important things happening in the world. Heck, as I was animating this section of the video, Ground News alerted me that Trump is reducing his 50-day deadline before imposing secondary sanctions on China and India. We'll get back to that later. But that is just one of the benefits of being able to curate your own newsfeed. And by going to ground.news/linesonmaps or scanning the QR code on your screen, you can get a 40% discount on a Vantage plan, which gives you access to all of these features and more. So thanks again to Ground News for their continued support of this channel. That takes us to a series of pivotal phone calls beginning on July 3rd, one day after the Pentagon froze the arms shipments in Poland. Trump spoke to Putin, one of many in a series of overtures that all ended the same way. Trump tells Putin that he wants to see a ceasefire and then an end of the war. Putin tells Trump that the situation is politically difficult, but that he too wants the war to end. Trump, concerned about wanting to complete the Indo-Pacific pivot, is unwilling to turn any further screws, and instead merely thanks Putin for his time. He then announces to the public that progress has been made as the peace process continues to ultimately go nowhere. Overnight, into the morning hours of July 4th, Russia strikes Kyiv with yet another record attack. 539 drones, 11 missiles, yet more damage to civilian infrastructure, civilian casualties are mounting, and so forth. Now, none of this was a surprise to anyone paying attention, the Trump administration included. Russia is now constantly completing new assembly lines for drone production. We will likely keep seeing new records set for the foreseeable future. But what was different this time was what happened here, less than 2 kilometers from the Ukrainian government plaza. It is the Polish consulate, and it got hit. Even if it was not directly the target, and even if the damage to the roof ended up being minor, it was still a NATO ally under attack from Russia. It is a far cry from the type of thing that would invoke Article 5's collective security provision. Do not worry, enough other things are happening there to raise alarms. But regardless, it was still not a good look for the alliance. Keith Kellogg subsequently received a phone call from Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. Sikorski was upset about the damage to Poland's consulate, and told Kellogg the same things that he posted online for the rest of the world to see. That Putin was mocking Trump's peace efforts, and that the United States needed to restore supplies of anti-aircraft ammunition to Ukraine. Indeed, 40 PAC-3 missiles, the ammunition for Patriot batteries, were still sitting in Poland thanks to Hegseth's unilateral order. It was the perfect confluence of factors to get real change here. Trump had been stringing the public along by letting the political narrative be that Putin was stringing him along. The truth, though, was that he did not want to take costly steps. Except saying that would be even more politically damaging, so we got the narrative that we got. However, Putin kept this going for too long, especially with the civilian targeting. It has turned into a personal matter for Trump, a domain in which Trump is more willing to pay costs. Second, Hegseth's camp had fumbled the policy change. In the aggregate, Trump may have been willing to entertain the Pentagon's argument. And, indeed, it was that precise concern about stockpiles that convinced Trump to withdraw from the Yemen conflict a bit early. But the decision, and especially the lack of communication to key stakeholders, both domestic and abroad, received a ton of pushback from congressional Republicans. Those wishing to see Ukraine get more aid probably should have moved to this strategy a long time ago, rather than prolonging the bizarre narrative that Trump was oblivious to how Putin was stringing him along, rather than Trump stringing the rest of us along. But, in any case, Congress had at long last made its move after months of its own stalling. Finally, Poland was now a victim of the civilian targeting that Trump had been insisting that Putin terminate. As a callback to earlier, remember that this is the same Poland that is the gold standard of NATO military spending, and it was occurring less than 2 weeks after the NATO allies agreed to raise core defense spending to 3.5% of GDP. If you want to create an incentive structure for countries to follow through, then you need to reward those who comply. Well, Kellogg phoned Trump and updated him on the situation. Trump told Kellogg to contact Hegseth and have him lift the weapons pause. Given the rift in the White House, that must have felt like a nice win for Kellogg. The former general had been arguing for more than a year that the United States should ramp up aid to Ukraine conditional on Russia not agreeing to a ceasefire, and he was starting to see his recommendation put into practice. The PAC-3 missiles were heading back to Ukraine to help defend against a repeat of the July 4th barrage. Now, if the story ended here, this would probably not be worth talking about. Trump could have gone back to his 4th of July festivities and not thought much about it again. After all, the focus of this whole saga is 40 missiles. I repeat, 40 missiles. Obviously, that is better for Ukraine than 0 missiles, but 40 missiles is not about to have a tangible effect on the war outcome. However, the real power play came from across the Atlantic. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz saw an opportunity to go further. Under the previous Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Germany had taken a tepid approach to the war. Merz, in contrast, ran as a hawk and began looking for new paths forward from day one of his administration. What Ukraine really needed were more Patriot systems, the things that actually shoot the interceptor missiles, plus a long-lasting supply of those missiles, not just a band-aid supply of 40. Germany had Patriot systems in country, but transferring U.S. tech requires White House approval, and it would also leave Germany without interceptors to defend itself. Merz reasoned that Trump would be amenable to selling the next Patriot systems to come off the line, while forwarding German-owned Patriots to Ukraine immediately. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte saw an opportunity to go further. Merz's intuition was correct, but there was no need to stop at German-owned Patriots. Indeed, the Hague Summit Declaration explicitly says that aid to Ukraine counts toward each member's pledge to contribute 3.5% of GDP to core defense. Thus, European allies could take advantage of Trump's current disposition and institutionalize a system through NATO to give Ukraine access to more key American systems. Trump would get to make a splashy announcement like he always enjoys. Ukraine would get the equipment it needs at a critical time in the war, and the sales would keep Trump's interest over the long term. All told, the deal and announcement came together just 10 days after the strike on Kyiv. For an organization often accused of paralysis by committee, it shows how fast things can happen when the incentives are aligned. Also impressive for the war effort was how quickly the transfers began. The initial block is already in Ukraine, and the transfer came without fanfare, a good sign for operational security if future transfers could give Ukraine some offensive advantages. Details about what weapons might go next are correspondingly vague. This Washington Post story cites 2 anonymous officials as indicating that radars, jamming systems, drone interceptors, and artillery are on the agenda. But that does not say much beyond what someone in the dark might have already guessed. But there was a second part of Trump's U-turn worth briefly examining. As far as we can tell, it was not directly related to the Polish consulate incident. But Trump announced it at the same time, and it might have reflected his overall change in disposition on the conflict. It is the threat of secondary sanctions, which, and please shout this from the rooftops to anyone who says otherwise, do not target Russia. Rather, the secondary sanctions will place large tariffs on countries still doing business with Russia, which are primarily China and India, though others might get dragged down too. Oil and whatnot. This was not designed to move as fast as the military aid was. Trump set a 50-day deadline at the press conference, a reasonable choice if he wanted to try to have China and India work on the United States' behalf to convince the Kremlin to halt its advances. U.S. businesses might also want some time to internalize the possibility and reroute orders accordingly. The flip side, of course, was speculation that we were just reverting back to the seemingly never-ending deadlines. But unlike the weapons transfers, there is much more uncertainty about whether that will come into effect. And also unlike weapons transfers, the sanctions will come at a real cost to the United States instead of being net profitable. Tariff rates exceeding 100% will do that. Yesterday, Trump added further intrigue to the matter by announcing during a meeting with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer that he was going to cut the deadline to between 10 and 12 days. Quick reminder that this is a verbal threat, so cue the standard caveat. Imposing secondary sanctions would be one of the most expensive moves that the United States has made over the course of the war, and thus the much deeper questions about how effective the policy will be now become critically important. Same for questions about just how much it will hurt U.S. consumers in the meantime. In turn, what might happen there is a separate story for a separate video. Hey, maybe that would be a great topic for the next video, in fact. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. Go to ground.news/linesonmaps or scan the QR code on your screen to get a 40% discount on a Vantage plan. And if you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.